When Mel Gibson lost his Malibu mansion to the raging LA wildfires, he didn't mourn. He jumped into his truck and drove straight into the flames. What happened next turned whispers of a controversial past into stories of an unexpected hero. The January 2025 Los Angeles wildfires had left a scar across the city that no amount of time could easily heal. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. The skyline smudged with gray even days after the flames had been subdued. The devastation wasn't just local. It had captured the nation's attention, a somber symbol of loss and resilience. Candace Harper stood in the middle of a makeshift evacuation center, surrounded by scattered cots, half-empty water bottles, and the hum of quiet conversations. It was her first major assignment as a reporter, but it wasn't what she had hoped for. Covering a human interest angle wasn't exactly how she'd planned to break into serious journalism. Her editor had been clear. Find the heart in the story, the moments of hope amidst the ruin. So, she trudged from one weary evacuee to the next, recorder in hand, asking them about their experiences. At first, the stories were similar, accounts of frantic escapes, near misses, and the numbing realization that everything they owned was gone. But then a different narrative began to emerge. There was this man, an elderly woman said, her voice trembling as she held onto a cup of coffee. He came out of nowhere driving this old truck, pulling people out of their houses, even carrying pets. Her eyes welled up as she added, "He saved us." Candace leaned in, intrigued. Who was he? The woman hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know his name. But you'd recognize him. She moved on to a young couple who shared a similar story. He didn't even think twice, the man said. Our street was completely cut off, and he just kept coming back, clearing debris, getting people into his truck. We couldn't believe it. Did he say who he was? Candace pressed, trying to coax more details. The man exchanged a glance with his partner. We figured it out later. He's famous. Not the kind of person you'd expect to see doing something like that. This only deepened her curiosity. She asked several others, and the story was always the same. A man who had risked his life to help others, who had been everywhere at once during the worst moments of the fire. But every time she asked for specifics, she was met with vague answers, sidelong glances, and a strange reluctance to name him. Finally, an older man with soot-streaked hands leaned in conspiratorially. You'll know when you see him, he murmured. Not everyone likes him, but, well, you can't argue with what he did out there. The words lingered in her mind as she left the shelter, her thoughts a storm of suspicion and intrigue. Someone famous. Someone controversial. It didn't take much for her to imagine the worst, a celebrity trying to clean up a tarnished reputation with a well-timed act of heroism. But as much as she doubted, she couldn't ignore the genuine awe in the voices of the people he had helped. Who was this man, and why was he so careful to remain in the shadows? The relief shelter buzzed with quiet urgency, the low hum of conversations mingling with the shuffle of boxes and the cries of exhausted children. Candace stepped through the door, the acrid scent of smoke still clinging to the air. Her notebook was tucked under one arm, her recorder in hand, as she scanned the room for someone, that might answer the questions still spinning in her mind. She had followed a lead here, hoping to find the mysterious figure everyone had been talking about. What she didn't expect was to see him. There, by a table stacked with supplies, stood Mel Gibson. He was almost unrecognizable, dressed in worn jeans and a soot-streaked jacket, his hair disheveled and his face lined with exhaustion. He moved with purpose, handing out bottles of water, speaking softly to evacuees, and crouching to comfort a young boy clutching a stuffed animal. Candace froze, her heart racing with equal parts disbelief and intrigue. Mel Gibson. The Mel Gibson. A man whose name conjured a complicated legacy of fame, scandal, and public judgment. She had read the headlines. His Malibu mansion, worth millions, had been reduced to ash in the fire. Yet here he was, helping strangers, when he could have been mourning his own loss. For a moment, She simply watched him. He didn't seem to notice the way people looked at him. Some with gratitude, others with quiet curiosity. To them, he wasn't the Hollywood star who had fallen from grace. He was just a man lending a hand. But to Candace it didn't add up. She tightened her grip on her recorder and walked toward him. "Mr. Gibson," she called, her voice breaking the low murmur of the room. He turned, his blue eyes meeting hers with a calm that surprised her. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Sure," he said, his tone even, though his expression betrayed a flicker of caution. "What about?" She wasted no time. "You've been helping out a lot here. People are calling you a hero, but some might wonder why, especially since you just lost your own home. Seems like a lot to take on." His gaze didn't waver. "Why not?" he replied simply. "People needed help. I was here. That's all." "Is it though?" she pressed, her skepticism showing. "You have to admit, given your history, it looks like you're trying to fix your image. A PR move, maybe?" He let out a slow breath, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "You're free to think what you want," he said. "But this isn't about me. It's about them." He gestured to the evacuees around them, his voice steady. "I've lost things before, big things. But nothing's worse than losing people. If I can keep that from happening, I'll do what I can." Candace faltered, her certainty shaken. She had expected defensiveness, maybe anger. Instead, there was only calm conviction. As she stepped back, one thought lingered. How could a man with so much to grieve prioritize everyone else? Candace worked her way through the shelter, listening to one story after another, each one adding another layer to the enigma of Mel Gibson. Every person she spoke to described the same man, tireless, fearless, and seemingly indifferent to his own safety. Yet with every glowing account, Candace's doubts grew louder. People had a way of romanticizing tragedy, elevating flawed figures to sainthood in the face of disaster. Was that what was happening here? Or was there more to this man than she was willing to admit? Near the entrance, a firefighter sat on a folding chair, his uniform streaked with ash and his face shadowed by exhaustion. Candace approached, introducing herself and asking if he'd seen Gibson during the fires. The man, his name tag read Ramirez, let out a low whistle and leaned back, as if conjuring the memory. "Yeah, I saw him," he said. "Hard to miss a guy like that in the middle of all that chaos." "What exactly did he do?" she asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Ramirez shook his head, as if still processing it himself. There was this neighborhood, completely cut off by the fire. Trees down, power lines sparking, flames everywhere. We couldn't get our trucks in, and people were trapped. He showed up in this old truck, beat to hell, but still running. At first, we thought he was another evacuee trying to get out, but then we realized he was going in. Over and over, pulling families out, pets, anything he could load into that truck. Candace blinked, caught off guard. "And his house?" Ramirez's expression darkened. "Right in the fire's path. We told him he needed to leave, to save what he could. He didn't even flinch. Just said, 'There's more time to save people than things.'" He sighed heavily. By the time he finally stopped, his place was gone, burned to the ground. He didn't even look back. The image of Mel Gibson in the middle of such chaos, risking everything while losing everything, didn't fit with the man she thought she knew. "Why do you think he did it?" she asked, her voice softer now. Ramirez shrugged, pulling a water bottle from his side pocket. "Beats me. Guilt maybe? Redemption? Or maybe he just doesn't want anyone else to lose what he's lost. But I'll tell you this, you don't see that kind of thing often. Most people panic." "He didn't." Candace nodded, thanking him before moving on, her thoughts a jumble of admiration and suspicion. She found a mother sitting with her 2 young daughters, their faces streaked with soot but calm now. The woman described how Gibson had pulled their car from a ditch with his truck, then drove them to safety while the fire roared behind them. "He wouldn't even let us thank him," she said, her voice trembling. "Just said to take care of my girls." Candace wrote it all down, but the question still nagged at her. What drives a man to act so selflessly while his own life burns around him? Was it guilt, penance, or something far more complicated? She couldn't shake the feeling there was still more to uncover. Candace found Mel near the back of the shelter, stacking crates of water bottles alongside a group of volunteers. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the half-open doors. She approached him with purpose, her recorder in hand, her mind sharp with questions she couldn't leave unanswered. He noticed her and straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans as she stopped a few feet away. "You again," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What can I do for you this time?" "I need to understand something," Candace said, skipping the pleasantries. "I've spoken to dozens of people today, and they all say the same thing. You risked your life to save strangers, even as your house was burning. Why? What are you trying to prove?" Mel studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he said simply. She shook her head, frustration creeping into her voice. "Then what is it? Redemption? Guilt? You've had a controversial past. Don't tell me this has nothing to do with that." His expression shifted slightly, the faint smile replaced by something heavier. He leaned against the wall, folding his arms as he looked at her. "You think I'd put myself in the middle of a wildfire to fix my reputation? That I'd trade my home, everything I own, for some good press?" "I don't know," she admitted. "That's why I'm asking." For a long moment, he was silent, his gaze distant. Then, quietly, he said, "When I was 19, there was a fire back home. It started small, a brush fire, they said, but it spread faster than anyone expected. My family lived on the outskirts of town, and by the time we realized it was coming, it was too late." He paused, his voice tightening. "We lost everything. My parents got out, but my little brother, he didn't." Candace's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. He nodded, his jaw tightening as he continued. "I couldn't save him. I tried, but I was too late. That kind of thing doesn't leave you. Every time I hear about a fire, I see his face, hear his voice." He exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "So, yeah, maybe I'm trying to make up for something, but not my reputation. I'm trying to make sure no one else has to feel what I felt that day. If I can save even one person, it's worth it." Candace stood there, her questions fading into the background as his words sank in. She had come looking for a motive, a flaw, something to fit her narrative. But what she found was raw, unfiltered humanity. For the first time, she saw him not as a celebrity or a man with a checkered past, but as someone who had been shaped by unimaginable loss, and who had chosen to channel that pain into something good. She lowered her recorder, unsure of what to say. The man standing before her was more complicated than she had imagined, and the story she thought she wanted to tell no longer seemed so clear. Candace sat at her desk, the shelter's lingering scent of smoke and ash still clinging to her jacket. Her recorder sat beside her, filled with hours of testimonies, stories of rescue, bravery, and devastation. The faces of the people she'd interviewed played in her mind. The firefighter who'd watched Mel Gibson make trip after trip into the flames. The mother cradling her daughters because he'd pulled their car from danger. The elderly woman who had described him shielding her with his jacket. And then there was Mel himself, his voice calm but heavy as he'd recounted the fire that had taken his little brother. She stared at her blank screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure where to begin. Her editor's voice echoed in her mind, sharp and insistent. "Don't forget who he is, Candace. The guy's got a past. You can't just sweep that under the rug because he did something good. People love a redemption story, but they need the dirt to go with it." Candace had nodded at the time, agreeing because it was easier than pushing back. But now the idea made her stomach churn. What was the point of this assignment if all she did was rehash old headlines? She pressed play on her recorder, letting the voices of the survivors fill the room. Each one told the same story, not just of being saved, but of the way Mel had been there, steadfast, focused, and unflinching in the face of danger. These weren't the words of people swept up in celebrity awe. They weren't exaggerating for attention. They were raw, honest accounts of a man who had put everything on the line to help others. She couldn't reconcile their words with the caricature of Mel that the media, herself included, had perpetuated for years. But she couldn't ignore his past either. It was there unavoidably so, a history of scandals, mistakes, and controversies that had made him a figure of public debate. Her editor was right about one thing. People wouldn't believe her story if she left it out. Still, focusing on it felt wrong, almost cruel. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the blinking cursor, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Finally, she opened her notebook and started drafting. She wrote about the fire's destruction, the lives it had upended, and the way it had brought out the best in some and the worst in others. She wrote about Mel Gibson, his home lost to the flames, driving an old truck through burning streets to save strangers. She included his past not as a weapon, but as context, proof of how far he'd come and how complicated people could be. She didn't gloss over his flaws, but she refused to let them overshadow what he had done. When she finished, she sat back, her heart pounding. The story was honest, balanced, and unflinching. But she couldn't help wondering how the world would respond. Would they see the man she had met, or would they cling to the version they already knew? The evening air carried a solemn quiet, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices and the crackle of a nearby bonfire. Hundreds had gathered at the makeshift vigil, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of candles, each flame a tribute to the lives impacted by the fire. Survivors stood together, sharing stories of loss and resilience, while volunteers and first responders received heartfelt applause for their tireless efforts. Among the crowd, Candace weaved her way through, notebook in hand, though tonight she wasn't here to report. She had come to understand. She spotted Mel at the edge of the gathering, leaning against a tree, his posture relaxed, but his gaze distant. He was alone, as he had been all evening, deliberately avoiding the center of attention. Despite the murmurs of gratitude that followed him wherever he went, he seemed content to let others take the spotlight. Candace hesitated, watching him for a moment before finally making her way over. "You don't do speeches, I take it," she said softly, breaking the silence. Mel glanced at her, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. "Not my thing. You're the reason half these people are here," she pressed gently. "They want to thank you." "They already have," he replied, his voice calm. "They're alive. That's all that matters." Candace opened her mouth to say more, to ask the questions still lingering in her mind. But before she could speak, a man in firefighter gear approached, urgency etched on his face. "We've got flare-ups near the canyon," he said quickly. "They're calling for extra hands. You in?" Mel straightened, his body language shifting instantly, his expression sharpening. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "Let's go." "Wait," Candace called, her voice tinged with both frustration and disbelief. "You're leaving? Again?" He turned back to her, his gaze steady, but kind. "There's work to do." "Just one more question," she pleaded. "Why do you keep doing this? Why not let someone else take over?" He paused, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "Because if you're in a position to help, you do. Simple as that." With that, he gave her a small nod, then followed the firefighter into the darkness. Candace stood there, watching him disappear into the night, her notebook forgotten in her hands. Her mind raced with everything she wanted to say, the questions she wanted to ask, but she knew now they didn't matter. Some people weren't looking for answers, recognition, or redemption. Some people simply acted because it was the right thing to do. As the crowd around her began to disperse, she tucked her notebook into her bag and lit one of the vigil's candles. It wasn't just for those who had been lost to the fire. It was for those who had risked everything to save others. And as she stared at the flame, she realized that some stories weren't meant to be neatly tied up. Sometimes, the hero simply walks away, their actions speaking louder than any words ever could. Please don't forget to watch more heartwarming stories on your screen. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on our latest stories.